I froze all my accounts. You came back from the army mentally unstable and crazy, so my family will sell your house. The freezing tone of my dad David echoed through the phone precisely when my card was declined for a simple $4.50 cup of coffee. Bleeding through the receiver was the mocking laughter of my younger sister. Just be a good girl and hold your hand out to ask me for money. Don't make a scene. I, a United States Navy captain who had just survived a grueling 9-month deployment at sea, was being stripped of my assets and honor by my own flesh and blood. They used a temporary power of attorney to turn me into an ATM, draining my life savings to feed a parasitic youngest daughter. But they forgot who they were messing with. I didn't bother arguing. I coldly hung up the phone, put on my captain's uniform, and marched straight to the Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps. And exactly 2 hours later, my phone screen flashed violently with 57 missed calls from my dad harmonizing with the blaring sirens of an FBI raid. Before I reveal how my own parents forced me to trigger that FBI raid, please take a moment to like and subscribe to this channel. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there, because this level of betrayal is something no one should ever face alone. I had just returned from a brutal 9-month deployment, seeking nothing but the quiet comfort of the home I shared with my late husband, Arthur. 9 months of salt-crusted uniforms, diesel fumes, and the constant bone-deep hum of turbine engines beneath my feet. Arthur's house was the only anchor I had left, the only place his memory still lived in the creak of the floorboards and the faint trace of his cologne on the bedroom curtains. But the peace was a lie. The nightmare began at the base coffee shop when my military credit card declined for a simple cup of black coffee, and I immediately drove to the military credit union, my instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The air in branch manager Marcus Thorne's office was unusually heavy, reeking of sterile floor cleaner and unspoken bad news. Marcus, a man who usually greeted me with a crisp salute and a firm handshake, sat behind his desk looking at me with a sickening pity I absolutely despised. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled up my classified financial file on the glowing monitor. His eyes darted nervously away from the screen, refusing to meet mine. He cleared his throat twice before he could even begin to speak, and the sound was too loud in the suffocating silence of that small, sterile room. Captain Scott, your mailing address, bank statements, and all contact info were changed last week. Your entire salary and military benefits have been set to auto-forward into your sister Jessica's account. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I sat in that rigid leather chair and stared at the monitor, the words slowly carving a canyon of betrayal straight through my chest. 20 years of combat pay. Every hazardous duty bonus I had earned, dodging hostile fire in the Persian Gulf. Arthur's death benefits paid out because my husband came home in a box draped with stars and stripes. All of it, every single cent, rerouted to a 32-year-old woman who proudly called herself a startup entrepreneur, but spent her days sleeping until noon and draining every wallet within arm's reach. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached, but I kept my posture rigidly straight, locking my muscles in place. Auto-forwarded to my sister. A 32-year-old parasite who proudly called herself a startup entrepreneur, but had never turned a profit on a single venture in her entire pampered life. Before my brain could even begin to process the sheer audacity of the humiliation, Federal Agent Sarah Jenkins walked into the office, her stride purposeful, her expression unreadable. She placed a thick red-stamped JAG dossier on the glass desk with a heavy thud that made the pen holder rattle, and Marcus flinch in his chair. She methodically explained that my dad and my mom had not just redirected my direct deposits. They had actively filed a permanent medical power of attorney extension with the county clerk's office 3 days after my deployment began, while I was already at sea and completely unreachable. I stared down at the stack of paperwork she pushed toward my side of the desk. In black and white ink, my parents legally claimed I was voluntarily surrendering my entire estate due to severe psychological instability brought on by combat-related trauma and complicated grief following the death of my spouse. They were legally erasing my sanity, aggressively weaponizing my demanding military service and Arthur's death as an excuse to officially label me crazy and strip away my autonomy. They attached a letter supposedly written by me begging them to take control because I could no longer function. I had never written that letter. I had never seen it before in my life. I picked up the primary document, my leather gloves creaking slightly under the pressure. The signature at the bottom of the page was a near-perfect replica of my own handwriting, a forgery so precise it had fooled the notary public and every clerk who processed it. A freezing, paralyzing chill ran down my spine. They were not just stealing my money, they were attempting to strip me of my citizenship rights, my military rank, and my basic human dignity. I aggressively forced my breathing into a tactical rhythm. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. Panic was exactly what they needed on record to prove their fabricated PTSD claim to the federal government. One outburst from me, one raised voice, one slammed fist, and their entire narrative would be validated. Marcus looked down at his keyboard, completely unable to meet my intense gaze. He added softly, almost apologetically, "Your current spending limit has been squeezed down to just $500 a month." The pity in his tone made my stomach churn so violently I tasted bile. I had commanded hundreds of sailors through the most violent, unforgiving typhoons in the Pacific Ocean, making life-or-death decisions in split seconds, while water crashed over the bridge and alarms screamed at 80 decibels. Now my parents had just legally reduced me to a dependent toddler needing a meager monthly allowance. They did not see a highly decorated Navy veteran who had earned every ribbon on her chest through blood and service. They saw a bottomless gold mine, a lifeless asset to fund my sister's vanity and laziness. Every agonizing sacrifice I had made over the last 20 years, every terrifying deployment where I kissed Arthur goodbye, knowing it might be the last time, every lonely night staring at the black ocean and praying I would come home alive, it was all being funneled directly into my sister's luxury shopping bags and failed business ventures. My dad and my mom had cold-bloodedly designated me as the sacrificial lamb to protect their golden child. I absolutely refused to cry. Tears are a luxury a commanding officer cannot afford when surrounded by enemies, even if those enemies happen to share her DNA. I slid the forged document back across the glass desk with a steady, unwavering hand. I looked Agent Sarah Jenkins dead in the eye, my voice completely devoid of any emotional tremor cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a surgical scalpel. "I never signed this extension. This is a forgery." The moment those words left my mouth, the agonizing, suffocating pain of familial betrayal transformed into something far more dangerous. It crystallized into a cold, pitch-black fury that settled into my bones like concrete. I realized in that exact second that my mom and my dad were dead to me. The people who had raised me, who had packed my school lunches and driven me to swim practice, and waved goodbye at the recruiting station 20 years ago, those people were gone, permanently replaced by opportunistic vultures feeding on my grief and exploiting the trust I had placed in them before every deployment. I stood up from the leather chair, sharply adjusted the collar of my uniform until the eagle insignia sat perfectly against my throat, and gave Sarah a definitive, commanding nod. The silent war had officially begun. That evening, the stretching shadows of my empty house threatened to swallow me whole. Every corner of this property was bought and paid for with Arthur's life insurance, literal blood money from a fallen hero who died serving his country on a classified operation in the Persian Gulf. They never told me exactly how it happened. Classified. All I got was a 2-star admiral standing on my porch at 6 in the morning, a folded flag pressed against his chest, and the words, "Every military spouse prays they will never hear." Arthur Sergeant First Class Scott killed in action. I was handed a medal in a velvet box and a government check that was supposed to represent 29 years of a man's life. His laughter, his steady hands, the way he called me captain, even before I earned the rank just because he believed I would. That money bought this house. Arthur's blood was in every brick, every beam, every floorboard that creaked under my feet. I stood motionless by the cold brick fireplace, the suffocating silence of the living room pressing heavily against my eardrums. Arthur's reading glasses still sat on the side table where he left them before his last deployment. His favorite flannel shirt still hung on the hook by the back door. I reached out and picked up his freezing metal dog tags from the mantelpiece, clutching them in my fist until the sharp metal edges cut painfully into my skin. Warm blood seeped between my fingers and dripped onto the stone hearth, each drop a small, sharp reminder that I was still alive. still standing, still capable of feeling something other than the numbness my family was trying to impose on me. The physical pain anchored my mind to reality, preventing me from spiraling into the darkness they were trying to manufacture around me. I could not let my dad desecrate Arthur's sacred legacy. My blood boiled with the overwhelming violent urge to drive straight over to my parents' house, kick the front door off its hinges, and demand they return everything they stole. But my training kicked in with the force of a command barked across a flight deck. Brute force wins minor skirmishes, not massive wars. The next morning, I bypassed my family completely and walked straight into the Navy JAG headquarters to meet Captain Robert Vance. The heavy, imposing oak doors of the military tribunal building felt significantly more like a safe haven than my childhood home ever did. The polished floors, the sharp scent of leather and wood polish, the quiet authority that radiated from every wall, this was my real home. This was where people earned respect through merit, not through bloodline manipulation. I sat rigidly across from Robert, delivering my situation report with the chilling mechanical detachment of a battlefield briefing. I detailed the medical forgery, the massive financial drain, the forged signature, and my sister's smirking, boundless greed. Robert did not offer empty condolences or patronizing pity. He simply tapped his silver pen rhythmically against the polished mahogany desk, a cold, calculating smile creeping onto his weathered, scarred face. He was a legal sniper, a man who dismantled careers and criminal empires for a living, and he had just been handed a target-rich environment. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, locking his piercing eyes directly onto mine. He knew exactly what my combat instincts were screaming at me to do, to attack, to confront, to burn their lies to the ground. And he was there to systematically countermand those instincts with a superior strategy. The enemy is most careless when they think their prey is already broken. Teresa. He murmured, his voice laced with absolute lethal precision. I leaned forward in my chair, the tactical commander inside me aggressively demanding immediate, decisive action. I wanted to freeze the bank accounts this very second, lock them out of the estate, and arrest them for federal fraud before sundown. But Robert immediately raised a hand, stopping me dead in my tracks. His scarred fingers were steady, his expression carved from granite. Do not confront them. Any anger from you right now will be used as evidence to solidify their claim that you have PTSD and are out of control. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a dangerous conspiratorial whisper that barely carried across the mahogany desk. Let them keep draining it. We need them to leave enough of a trail to build an ironclad system of evidence that cannot be denied. He bluntly warned me that if I fought back now, they would simply use their fake medical power of attorney to force me into a private psychiatric ward within 48 hours. They would eagerly strip my military rank, destroy my dignity, and permanently take my freedom. The court would side with the concerned parents of a supposedly unstable veteran. I had to let them think they were winning. I had to let the noose they were tying around my neck become the noose around their own. The brilliant, agonizing cruelty of his strategy washed over me like ice water. If I fought back now, I was a crazy, unhinged veteran having a violent episode, exactly what they claimed on paper. If I played dead, they would inevitably hang themselves with their own insatiable, arrogant greed. Every dollar they stole was another count on a federal indictment. Every forged document was another year in a federal penitentiary. Robert slid a small encrypted recording device across the desk toward me. He wanted me to capture every conversation, every lie, every patronizing word my family spoke in my presence. He wanted timestamps, locations, and context. He wanted a prosecutorial fortress built entirely from their own voices and their own greed. I nodded slowly, slipping my dark aviators back on my face to hide the predatory, violent glint in my eyes. I would become exactly what my mom and my dad wanted, the broken, depressed, incompetent daughter who could not function in civilian life. I would shuffle my feet. I would avoid eye contact. I would let my voice tremble and my hands shake when they spoke to me. And I would let them feast on my bank accounts, completely unaware that the banquet was heavily laced with a federal trap. I stood up, offering Robert a sharp, perfectly executed salute. He returned it with the gravity of a man sending a soldier deep behind enemy lines. I was no longer a victim weeping over stolen money in the dark. I was a commander setting a massive, invisible ambush for my own family. For the next 3 weeks, I forced myself to live inside a suffocating, sickeningly sweet stage play, orchestrated by the people who were supposed to love me. My dad would frequently sit on my front porch, comfortably sipping my expensive scotch, the bottle he took from my liquor cabinet without asking, wearing his perfectly practiced mask of deep paternal concern. He would pat my shoulder with feigned warmth that made my skin crawl beneath my cotton shirt. "Daughter, you've sacrificed so much. Just rest. Let the family handle the finances. You're vulnerable. It's easy to get scammed out there." He would say, his voice thick with manufactured tenderness, while his eyes calculated the market value of my living room furniture. Meanwhile, my mom would bring over heavy Tupperware containers of homemade chicken soup, rubbing my back with fake sympathy, while her eyes secretly monitored my incoming mail stacked on the kitchen counter. She was looking for bank statements she thought she might have missed any account she had not yet drained. Under the dining table, my thumb actively traced the record button on my concealed phone, capturing every toxic, patronizing word they spoke in crystal-clear digital audio. I flawlessly played the broken soldier, swallowing my intense disgust every single time my mom kissed my forehead, with those lying lips, the same lips that had told the notary I was mentally incompetent. I executed my part without a single crack in the facade. I slouched my shoulders, avoided direct eye contact, and acted completely terrified of the outside world. One afternoon, I deliberately tested their control. I timidly asked for $800 of my own money to fix the failing transmission on my old Jeep. My sister scoffed instantly, rolling her eyes in exaggerated annoyance as she scrolled through her brand-new smartphone bought entirely with my military salary. She barely looked up from her screen. "Teresa, you're unstable. Driving right now is too dangerous. It's best if you stay home. Let me invest that money into my new project, and when it profits, I'll buy you a new car." Her new project. The fourth failed venture this year alone. The last 3 had been an online boutique, with unsold inventory still rotting in cardboard boxes in her garage, a consulting firm with 0 clients, and a website that had never been updated past the landing page, and a cryptocurrency scheme that evaporated in 2 weeks, along with $6,000 of my money. My mom and my dad nodded in immediate unison, loudly praising her supposed financial wisdom as though she were a Wall Street prodigy instead of a 32-year-old parasite who had never earned an honest dollar in her life. I kept my head bowed, staring blankly at the hardwood floor, playing the defeated sibling. But beneath the table, my hands clenched into fists so violently tight that my fingernails dug deep into my flesh, drawing warm beads of blood that dripped silently onto my jeans. The true bottomless depth of their depravity hit me exactly 3 days later. My phone buzzed in the dead silence of the afternoon. It was Thomas Riley, a retired Marine and owner of the local marina, a man who had served alongside Arthur before his final deployment. His voice was grim, completely devoid of his usual pleasantries. "Teresa, I don't mean to pry into family business, but I saw your dad David showing some real estate agents around your house. He said you're moving to a care facility and the house is up for an urgent sale." The air was violently sucked from my lungs, leaving me dizzy and gripping the edge of the kitchen counter for balance. Sell Arthur's house. The house where his boots still sat by the front door, the house where his coffee mug still occupied its spot on the second shelf. They were actually planning to erase the absolute last physical memory of my husband, just to fund my sister's delusions of grandeur. They were actively conspiring to liquidate my sacred sanctuary while I was still standing, breathing inside it. I stood frozen in the center of my living room, my eyes locked on Arthur's worn combat boots still sitting by the front door, the leather cracked and salt-stained from his last tour. The flickering, fragile flame of familial love that I had desperately tried to protect through all the lies and theft was instantly, permanently snuffed out. A cold, absolute, calculating darkness completely replaced it. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw furniture. I simply walked over to the thermostat, turned the heat down to match the ice in my veins, and methodically checked the heavy deadbolts on my doors one by one, front, back, garage, basement. My dad and my mom had officially crossed the point of no return. I opened my laptop, pulled up the hidden secure drive Robert had set up for me, and began uploading every recorded audio file, every conversation, every lie, every patronizing word they had ever spoken in my kitchen. I locked down my emotions, fully preparing my home for a brutal war they could not possibly comprehend. The psychological suffocation of constantly playing the helpless victim was taking a severe, undeniable toll on my mind. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning and barely recognized the woman staring back. My posture was slumping even when I was alone. Dark circles had carved themselves beneath my eyes. I was beginning to absorb the poison they were feeding me, beginning to wonder if maybe the broken soldier they described was becoming real. I desperately needed air that was not tainted by their lies. I drove my malfunctioning Jeep to the naval harbor, the only place on Earth where the world still made logical sense to me. Retired Admiral Richard Hayes was already waiting by the docks, his posture as rigid and unyielding as the steel hulls of the massive warships anchored just behind him. He did not ask for details about my personal life. A veteran commander always recognizes the hollow, exhausted stare of a soldier actively fighting a ghost. He stepped forward and placed a heavy, weathered hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and incredibly grounding. The sharp scent of diesel fuel and biting salt water washed over me, providing a clean, bracing contrast to the suffocating sweet perfume my mom constantly wore when she came over to rifle through my mail. The wind whipped against our faces as the Admiral looked me dead in the eye. He did not offer soft pity. He did not ask if I wanted to talk about my feelings. He offered a direct command. Teresa, I don't know what you're enduring, but remember this. The honor of the captain's rank on your shoulders does not allow you to break before any enemy, even if that enemy is hiding in your own home. Never let anyone trample the pride of a soldier. It was a precision strike straight to my soul. My spine instinctively straightened, locking into rigid attention. The heavy fog of depression and submissive compliance my family had violently forced upon me completely evaporated into the sea breeze. It left behind only pure, weaponized clarity. I was a captain of the United States Navy tested by fire and salt. I had navigated destroyers through hostile waters and buried my husband with full military honors. I did not cower. I did not beg. I did not break. I had barely returned to the driver's seat of my Jeep, the Admiral's words still echoing in my skull like artillery rounds, when Robert sent a secure, encrypted file to my phone. His accompanying message read simply, "Target acquired." I opened the attachment with steady fingers. It was an intercepted email directly from my dad to a predatory real estate firm known for liquidating properties fast and asking no questions. I zoomed in on the glowing text, the words burning themselves into my retinas with the permanence of a brand. "Make it quick. She's unstable, she doesn't know yet. We will finalize the house sale before she even realizes it. She does not know yet." The sheer blinding arrogance of that statement made my blood run cold. The absolute disdain for my intellect was staggering. My dad, a retired corporate manager who spent his career shuffling papers in a climate-controlled office, genuinely believed he had outsmarted a naval intelligence-trained captain who had spent 2 decades outmaneuvering hostile forces in the open ocean. They truly believed I was a mindless, broken puppet dancing on their strings, ready to be discarded the second they finished picking my bones clean. I did not delete the email. I forwarded it directly to Agent Jenkins with a 2-word execution-style command execute phase. Then I forwarded it to Robert with 3 words, green light confirmed. I aggressively turned the ignition, the sudden roar of the Jeep's engine cutting through the harbor's quiet morning silence like a battle cry. The engine that my sister had refused to let me fix with my own money now carried me toward their total destruction. I was entirely done living in the past, completely done playing the submissive victim in their twisted, pathetic family drama. As I drove back toward my house, the coastal highway stretching ahead of me in a clean, straight line, my mind shifted entirely into the present tense. The defensive line was officially permanently abandoned. I was now entirely on the offensive. Every recording I had made over the past weeks, every lie they had spoken in my kitchen, every condescending pat on the shoulder, every stolen dollar, it was all loaded into the chamber now. The email from my dad with his own fingerprints on it, his own words condemning him, was the final, undeniable nail in their coffin. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles stark white, coldly mapping out the exact coordinates of their impending destruction. Robert had the legal ammunition. Sarah had the federal warrants on standby. Eleanor had my assets locked behind walls they could not climb. The trap was set, baited and ready to be sprung. All that was left was to invite the prey to dinner. The timeline moved with lethal calculated speed over the next 2 months. I sat in a sterile, windowless boardroom with Eleanor Sterling, a 55-year-old civil rights attorney, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and absolutely zero tolerance for familial abuse. She had spent 30 years dismantling abusive guardianships and predatory conservatorships across 3 states, and she took my case with the cold ferocity of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. While my dad and my mom thought they completely controlled every aspect of my life, Eleanor and I were quietly building invisible high-voltage electric fences around my actual wealth. We legally locked down every hidden military pension offshore asset and life insurance policy my parents had not yet discovered because they were not explicitly listed in the original forged power of attorney. I was actively turning my financial portfolio into a lethal minefield, systematically securing the perimeter before the main assault. Every signature I made was precise, every document notarized in absolute secrecy to ensure they could not touch another dime. The agonizing collateral damage of this shadow war hit me that very weekend. My sister's 10-year-old daughter Lily dragged her worn-out teddy bear into my kitchen, her small footsteps barely audible on the cold tile. She looked up at me with massive, terrified eyes clutching the bear defensively to her chest. Her lower lip trembled, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Aunt Teresa, why did Grandpa say you're crazy? Do you have to go to the madhouse?" The breath violently left my lungs. I knelt down on the cold kitchen floor, the tile biting into my knees, and hugged her tightly to physically shield her from the poison her own family was feeding her. My arms wrapped around her small frame, and I could feel her heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. They were not just stealing my money. They were actively murdering my reputation in the eyes of a completely innocent child, poisoning her understanding of the world before she was old enough to question it. I stroked her hair, pressing my cheek against the top of her head, silently vowing that I would tear down their empire of lies, if only to protect her and her 8-year-old brother Sam from becoming just like them. The very next afternoon, my mom arrived to deliver what she believed was the final devastating blow. She set a tray of freshly baked goods on my kitchen counter, filling the room with the smell of sugar and butter that turned my stomach. A practiced smile was plastered across her face, the same smile she wore to church every Sunday, the same smile she had worn to the notary when she forged my signature. From her expensive designer purse bought entirely with my stolen funds, she pulled out a glossy high-end brochure. She placed it gently on the counter, smoothing it flat with her manicured fingers. "Teresa, sweetheart, we think you should go here to rest for a while. Fresh air doctors to care for you. You'll recover quickly. I will take care of the house." Her tone dripped with fake maternal warmth so thick it was suffocating. I stared down at the glossy photos of a private psychiatric facility nestled in the Virginia countryside. Manicured lawns, smiling nurses in pastel scrubs, locked gates disguised as decorative garden fences with ivy crawling over razor wire. The brochure described it as a retreat for individuals experiencing acute psychological distress, a place for healing and reflection. What the brochure did not mention was the involuntary commitment clause, buried in the fine print, the 60-day mandatory observation period during which a patient's legal guardian, in this case my parents, thanks to their forged power of attorney, would assume full control of all financial and property decisions. It was an involuntary psychiatric hold disguised as a luxury spa vacation, a legal prison wrapped in lavender-scented linens. They wanted to lock me away in a padded room, sedate me into compliance, and sell Arthur's house without any legal interference while I sat drooling in a common room 300 miles away. The proceeds would be split between my dad's retirement fund and my sister's next doomed business venture before I even knew the house was gone. My eyes turned as sharp and cold as a razor blade as I took the heavy brochure from her hands, but I forced my facial muscles into a frail, defeated smile. I let my shoulders slump, let my voice crack with manufactured fragility. "I'll think about it," I whispered, watching my mom's eyes light up with greedy, disgusting triumph. She practically skipped out the front door, already texting my dad before she reached her car. As soon as her taillights disappeared down the driveway, the pathetic facade dropped instantly. I walked directly to my office, closed the door, opened my tactical notebook, and dragged my pen across the page with brutal, tearing force. They have assumed the right to dictate my life. The net is cast. I picked up my phone, opened my calendar app, and sent out a mass invitation to my parents and my sister. Saturday night. My house. Formal attire requested. It was finally time for a family dinner. If you have ever had to smile through the pain while toxic relatives plotted your downfall right to your face, hit the like button right now. Share your own survival story in the comments, because holding back that kind of anger takes a toll only we understand. I hosted the dinner party at my house on a Saturday night. The pretext I gave them was simple: a quiet family gathering before I made major decisions about my future. The words major decisions had them salivating before they even got in the car. My dad, my mom, and my sister arrived wearing their absolute Sunday best, their eyes practically gleaming with unrestrained, arrogant greed. My sister had gotten a fresh manicure and a blowout for the occasion, her nails painted the deep red of a woman already spending money she had not yet stolen. My dad wore his best navy blazer, the one he saved for board meetings and country club dinners, tugging at the lapels with the self-importance of a man who believed he had already won. But they were not the only guests at the table. Sitting quietly among them were Robert Vance, Eleanor Sterling, Marcus Thorne, and Agent Sarah Jenkins, all dressed down in casual civilian clothes, perfectly masquerading as my supportive military buddies coming to say their final goodbyes to a troubled veteran. My mom even offered Sarah a glass of wine, completely oblivious that the woman accepting it with a polite smile had a federal badge and a loaded sidearm tucked beneath her cardigan. The trap was precisely set, the federal actors were perfectly in place, and the targets had willingly walked right into the center of the ambush. The tension in the dining room was thick enough to choke on, though only I could feel it. My dad completely dominated the conversation, his eyes actively roaming over my antique furniture and artwork, mentally cataloging what he would sell first, to the highest bidder. He commented on the oak dining table, running his fingers along the grain, already calculating its auction value. My sister continuously checked her phone, visibly irritated that the massive inheritance transfer had not happened yet, tapping her manicured nails aggressively on the wood. My mom bustled around, pouring expensive wine from a bottle she had purchased with my stolen salary, eagerly playing the gracious hostess in a house she planned to sell out from under me by Monday morning. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, the same seat Arthur used to occupy every Thanksgiving before he was deployed for the last time. I wore a sharp, tailored black dress that intentionally mirrored the strict lines of a military dress uniform. My posture utterly unbroken, my hands resting flat on the oak surface. The seat at the head of my table in my house, bought with my dead husband's blood. I watched them feast on food I paid for, drink wine, bought with my money, and plan the final dismantling of my entire life without a single shred of remorse. My sister even had the audacity to complain that the lamb was overcooked, pushing her plate away with an exaggerated sigh while sitting in a chair that belonged to the man whose death funded her manicures. As the main course was cleared away, my dad could not contain his arrogant triumph any longer. He stood up, tapping his silver spoon against his crystal wine glass, forcing the entire room into a self-congratulatory silence. He looked down at me with a sickeningly benevolent smile, perfectly masking his absolute malice. He cleared his throat with the theatrical gravity of a man delivering a corporate keynote. "Teresa, daughter, I'm so glad you've realized the family always wants what's best for you. You finally understand that letting the family manage everything is the safest and most correct choice, right?" The silence that followed his speech was deafening. Every undercover federal agent at the table subtly shifted their weight, their eyes locking onto me, waiting for my absolute command. Robert's hand moved imperceptibly toward the inside pocket of his jacket. Sarah's posture shifted from relaxed civilian to coiled federal agent in the span of a single heartbeat. I did not break eye contact with my dad. I slowly, deliberately picked up my water glass, letting the ice clink loudly against the rim in the suffocating quiet. I took a slow, calculated sip, the cold water sliding down my throat, and then I slammed the heavy glass back onto the oak table with a sharp, violent crack that made my sister physically jump in her seat, her phone clattering out of her hands. The temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero. I stared directly through my dad's victorious facade, my voice echoing with the unyielding authority of a commanding officer issuing a death sentence. "You're right. Family is the best manager, if it were an actual family. The sickeningly smug grin on my dad's face vanished instantly, replaced by a violent twitch of utter confusion. I reached beneath the oak table where I had secured it hours earlier, pulled out a massive red-stamped JAG classified dossier, and hurled it directly onto the center of the dining table with enough force to rattle every plate and glass on the surface. The dry, violent sound made my mom physically flinch, causing her to drop her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a sharp clatter that echoed off the walls. I stood up, towering over the table, my shadow casting a long, dark judgment over every single one of them. But unfortunately, you are not family, you are thieves. My voice cracked like artillery fire across the dining room. I ripped open the thick dossier, deliberately exposing the forged power of attorney, the unauthorized bank transfers, the printed transcripts of every conversation I had secretly recorded, and the damning emails to the predatory real estate brokers. The sheer volume of evidence was suffocating, page after page after page of their crimes laid bare under the warm light of the chandelier they planned to auction off. I did not step back. I commanded the room with absolute authority. I gave a sharp tactical nod to my allies. On cue, Robert, Eleanor, Marcus, and Sarah stood up in terrifying unison, their chairs scraping against the hardwood floor in a sound that cut through the stunned silence like a blade. The illusion of a friendly dinner shattered completely and permanently. Robert straightened his posture, his voice booming with the weight of the military tribunal. I am Captain Robert Vance, JAG lawyer. Sarah reached into her jacket and flashed her federal badge, the gold shield gleaming under the crystal chandelier. I am Federal Agent Sarah Jenkins. My dad's face turned the color of wet ash. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. My mom trembled violently, frantically grasping the edge of the table with both hands to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I stared down at them, watching their false, arrogant empire of control instantly crumble under the crushing weight of federal authority. But the real devastation had not landed yet. I turned my icy gaze to my sister, who was frantically looking around the room for an exit that did not exist. Her freshly manicured hands gripping the edge of her chair so hard, the red polish cracked against the wood. Agent Jenkins stepped forward with the deliberate, measured stride of a predator, pulling a secondary, thicker file from her jacket and tossing it directly into my sister's lap. Sarah's tone was razor-sharp, each word delivered with the precision of a scalpel. However, Mr. and Mrs. Scott, do you know what your precious daughter has done? Jessica Scott secretly stole Captain Teresa's platinum military credit card information to rack up fraudulent debt, borrowing tens of thousands of dollars to fund her lavish partying. And she forged your exact signatures to legitimize those debts. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal echoed in the silence that followed. For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. The oxygen violently left the room. My dad and my mom turned slowly, mechanically, like two people who had just heard a gunshot and were trying to locate the source of the wound. They stared in absolute paralyzed horror at their golden child, their precious youngest daughter, the baby they had coddled and protected and funded and worshipped at the expense of their eldest daughter's sanity, dignity, and financial independence. The child for whom they had committed federal crimes, forged documents, and attempted to institutionalize a decorated military officer. My sister backed away from the table, knocking her heavy dining chair over with a crash that split the silence like a breaking bone. She stammered incomprehensible, pathetic excuses, her face completely drained of blood, her manicured hands clutching at air. She had not just leeched off me. She had actively framed our own parents for massive federal fraud, forging their signatures on loan documents and credit applications they never saw, burying them under mountains of debt they did not even know existed. Every penny they stole from me, she stole twice over from them. The entire evil alliance imploded in a matter of seconds, destroyed not by me, not by the federal government, but by their own festering, bottomless greed eating itself alive from the inside out. I stepped forward, radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. I delivered the final words, looking my parents dead in the eye, making sure they would hear these words in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. I am not crazy. There is no psychological trauma. You are the federal criminals. The room was plunged into a suffocating, panicked silence that pressed down on everyone like a physical weight. My dad collapsed heavily into his chair, gasping for air, utterly broken by the horrific realization of his impending federal ruin, the bankruptcy, the criminal record, the complete destruction of every shred of social standing he had spent 68 years building. But my mom, desperately clinging to her lifetime of delusional denial, burst into hysterical, heaving tears. She reached out across the table, her manicured fingers trembling as she tried to grab my hand, completely ignoring the federal agent standing right next to her as if they were invisible. Her voice cracked with practiced manipulative desperation. "Teresa, I just wanted to help Jessica start her business. You're the older sister, you have plenty of money you have to yield to your sibling." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her words made my stomach violently churn. Even while staring down decades of federal prison time, even with a JAG lawyer and an FBI agent flanking her daughter, she genuinely believed I existed solely to be sacrificed on the altar of her youngest child. That was her core truth exposed at last. I was never her daughter. I was her offering. I aggressively ripped my hand away from her toxic grasp. I turned my back on her pathetic sobbing and walked slowly, deliberately to the oak display cabinet in the corner of the room, each footstep echoing on the hardwood like a drumbeat counting down to a verdict. I retrieved a heavy wooden box that held the most sacred items I owned, items that represented a sacrifice none of them could ever comprehend. Arthur had earned these medals on a mission none of them would ever know about, in a country none of them could find on a map, protecting a freedom all of them took for granted. He left our home on a Tuesday morning, kissed me at the door, told me he would be back in 6 weeks, and came home in a metal box 83 days later. Returning to the table, I opened the lid. The velvet lining was faded, now worn from the hundreds of times I had opened this box in the dark hours of the night, just to hold something that still carried his weight. I pulled out Arthur's Purple Heart and his final Medal of Honor. The cold metal pressed into my palm with the gravity of a life given in service to a nation that included these ungrateful parasites sitting at my table. I slammed the heavy metals onto the wood right in front of my dad. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap of judgment that silenced even my mother's sobbing and made the silverware jump on the tablecloth. I leaned over him close enough to see the broken blood vessels in his eyes, my own eyes burning with a righteous, blinding hatred refined by 20 years of military discipline. "The assets you are trying to tear apart, the house you are planning to sell, were bought with his blood and his life." My dad stared at the medals, his entire body convulsing as the horrific reality of his actions finally crushed him with its full, merciless weight. The Purple Heart gleamed under the chandelier, the gold and purple catching the light with a beauty that was almost cruel. Arthur bled for that medal. Arthur died alone on foreign soil for that medal, while this man sat in his air-conditioned living room, watching football and plotting how to steal the insurance money that came with the coffin. My dad hid his face in his trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably, his shoulders heaving with the force of a man confronted with the full, undeniable scope of his own depravity. He had not just stolen from his daughter. He had actively desecrated the sacrifice of a fallen American hero, a man who gave everything so that civilians like my dad could live freely just to coddle a lazy, parasitic youngest daughter who had never sacrificed a single thing in her entire pampered life. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper that cut straight to their marrow, a whisper so quiet and so devastating that every person in that room stopped breathing to hear it. Since when is a soldier's pride cheaper than my sister's laziness? Since when did bloodlines become a legal excuse for robbery? I did not wait for an answer. I did not want one. I looked at their pathetic, frantic tears, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical disgust. My heart was an impenetrable fortress of ice, forged in 20 years of military service, and tempered by the loss of the only man who ever loved me without conditions. Their remorse was not real. They were not crying for what they did to me or to Arthur's memory. They were not crying for the daughter they tried to institutionalize or the hero whose grave they spat on for profit. They were only crying because they got caught and permanently lost their cash cow. My mom was already calculating her next manipulation, already searching for the words that would make me soften. I could see it in her eyes, that desperate reptilian flicker of a woman who had spent 65 years bending people to her will, with tears and guilt. I straightened my posture, my face completely devoid of any sympathy, and gave Agent Jenkins a sharp, decisive nod, the silent command to proceed with the full weight of federal consequences. Sarah acknowledged with a curt nod of her own and began reading my sister her rights. The formal, measured cadence of federal procedure replacing the desperate sobs that filled the room. I turned my back on the people who used to be my family, walked out of the dining room without a backward glance, and left them to drown in the devastating wreckage of their own boundless greed. The front door closed behind me with a firm, final click. The night air hit my face, and for the first time in months, I breathed without the weight of their lies pressing down on my chest. A full year passed. The violent storm had completely settled, leaving behind a permanent ironclad new world order. With the absolute mountain of evidence Robert and Sarah had secured, the recorded conversations, the intercepted emails, the forged documents, the fraudulent credit applications, the damning real estate correspondence, I could have easily sent my dad, my mom, and my sister to federal prison for decades. The case file was 3 inches thick. The federal prosecutor called it one of the most clear-cut cases of elder financial abuse and identity theft she had seen in 15 years. But I looked at Lily and Sam, my sister's innocent children. Lily, who still carried that worn-out teddy bear everywhere she went. Sam, who had started drawing pictures of Navy ships and taping them to his bedroom wall because he wanted to be like his Aunt Teresa. I refused to make them orphans. I refused to let 2 more children be destroyed by the greed and selfishness of the adults who were supposed to protect them. A commander's mercy, however, always comes with brutal, unyielding discipline. I did not press criminal charges, but I had Eleanor establish an unbreakable legal trust locked behind 7 layers of legal protection that no court in the country could dissolve. I transferred every single asset I owned into it, every penny, every property, every investment, every military pension payment for the rest of my natural life. If I die, every cent goes immediately to veterans' charities and a scholarship fund for military families. My family will never see a single dime of my money again, not in this life or any other. I also established a separate private education fund for Lily and Sam, accessible only when they turned 18, controlled by Eleanor and completely invisible to their mother. The children would have a future. Their mother would have nothing. My sister's endless allowance was permanently severed. No more designer purses, no more fresh manicures, no more sleeping until noon and calling it entrepreneurship. The so-called startup genius was violently forced into reality, taking a grueling minimum-wage waitressing job at a highway diner on Route 17, just to keep the feds off her back and put food on the table for her kids. I heard through Thomas Riley at the marina that she worked the early shift 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, her cracked cuticles and dishwater hands a permanent reminder of the lifestyle she had destroyed with her own bottomless greed. Her brand new smartphone was gone, replaced by a prepaid flip phone. Her luxury car was repossessed within the first month. And my parents, in their twilight years, instead of enjoying the luxury retirement they tried to steal from me, were forced to take brutal, humiliating shifts, bagging groceries at the base commissary and mopping floors at the community center just to stay afloat. The massive fraudulent debt my sister had secretly racked up in their names. The credit cards she opened with their forged signatures. The loans she took out using their social security numbers came due with the merciless precision of compound interest. Their retirement savings were gone. Their home equity was gone. Their social standing in the community they had spent decades cultivating was gone. The parasite had finally eaten the hosts alive, consumed them from the inside out, and I left them all to their fate without a backward glance. It was a Tuesday morning, 7:12 a.m. The ocean air was crisp clean and completely untainted by the toxic presence of my past. Dressed in my perfectly pressed uniform medals gleaming proudly on my chest, I walked into the base coffee shop. The same coffee shop where this entire nightmare began. I smiled at the cashier, the same young sailor who had witnessed my humiliation a year ago, and ordered my $4.50 black coffee. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my card, and swiped it across the reader. A soft beep echoed through the quiet shop. Approved. No declines, no humiliation, no pity in the cashier's eyes, only a crisp salute and a warm smile. Only the quiet, undeniable power of total financial autonomy and completely reclaimed honor. As I walked out into the bright morning sunlight, coffee in hand, the warmth of the cup steady against my palm, I saw him. My dad wearing a faded, stained janitorial uniform 2 sizes too large for his shrinking frame, sweeping the sidewalk across the street from the base entrance. His navy blazer was gone. His country club membership was gone. His corporate handshake and boardroom swagger were gone. He was 69 years old, pushing a broom on a public sidewalk, a convicted financial abuser reduced to sweeping the dust off the same streets his daughter's Navy base looked down upon. He looked up from his broom, and our eyes met across 20 yards of pavement. His gaze was filled with bottomless regret and absolute reverence, the look of a man who finally understood too late the true cost of what he had destroyed. Not just the money, not just the legal standing. He had destroyed the one daughter who would have taken care of him in his old age, who would have driven him to doctor's appointments and sat by his bed when the time came. He traded that daughter for a parasite who was now too busy waitressing at a highway diner to answer his calls. But his feet remained planted on his side of the street. He did not dare cross. He knew the boundary was permanent, carved in federal ink, and reinforced with military steel, and the memory of a dead hero whose grave he had desecrated for profit. I did not smile. I did not wave. I gave him a curt military nod of acknowledgement, the same nod I would give a stranger, turned my back, and walked toward the docks, leaving him entirely in my shadow. Bloodline is never an immunity card for exploitation. Love without respect is just manipulation. If you agree that true respect sometimes means walking away and letting toxic relatives face their own karma, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Let me know in the comments how you found the courage to enforce your own boundaries, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.